Welcome to the Data Leadership Lessons Podcast. I'm your host, Anthony J. Algeman. Data is everywhere in our businesses, and it takes leadership to make the most of it. We bring you the people, stories, and lessons to help you become a data leader. Today, we welcome Dora Boussias. Dora is a strategic thought leader, passionate about organizational transformation towards data-driven culture, with expertise in enterprise information management and enterprise solution architecture. She specializes in leadership with enterprise-wide reach, including work at global organizations such as Stryker, GE Capital, and Prudential. Her industry experience includes financial services, healthcare, medical technology, and retail. Dora, I'm so excited to have you here today. Welcome.
Thank you, Anthony. I'm so excited to be here as well, and I'm honored to be here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and we've gotten to know each other. We've known each other through conferences over the last several years, and it's we'll have conversations here and there, and so it's great to have you on this show. And like I do with many of our first time guests, is why don't we just take a few minutes and why don't you give the guests at home or the audience at home some background on your career, your story, and kind of what you're focusing on now, and what motivates your career, and where data sort of plays a role in all that.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I've been in IT for a long time, 25 or so years, but I think of myself, as I say, like a business technologist, because for me, it's always about connecting back to the business. But I've been in this for a very long time. I've had exposure to different industries, like you mentioned as well earlier. Most of it is in finance and now medical device. And I've pretty much played every role you can think of in terms of being in IT. I actually started as a COBOL mainframe programmer.
Nice.
Many different technologies, and I really appreciate that experience, sure. But anything from requirements to design, to development, to support, program project management. The last 15 or more years, I've really focused on enterprise architecture. Because I really am very passionate about having a really strong foundation. I've been working mostly for different sites, but a lot of global large companies. You get complex systems. So how we make sure that we bring all that together, enterprise architecture, and always being very passionate about how good the data is around those processes in our systems. So I was fortunate to have the opportunity to go deep into the data space, enterprise information management, governance, stewardship, MDM, analytics, all of that good stuff.
So you were doing, and you started out much more on the technology-centric side of things. You're a programmer. You're doing that. Yes. Was there a moment where you were like, I want to take this more in a strategic direction. I want to do more with the business. How did you make that transition? What was it about that called out to you?
Right. So I did start more as a programmer, but even when I was a programmer, I used to wear a lot of different hats. For me, it was always important that not just the programming, creating the application, the software, whatever it is, but that it all had a really good, solid foundation. So I've always been driving with an architecture mindset, but it also meant, what is it that the business is trying to do? So I would always gravitate asking that question, working with the business folks and other folks in IT. And throughout my career, as I got exposure to more complex ecosystems, if you will, that's when I realized too that, look, the more complex this is there to enable our business. So it's not doing IT for the sake of IT. It's really, what is it that we're trying to solve? What is the business problem? And then pulling those IT skill sets along with it to progress it. Was there a particular time? I think it was kind of like always there, but maybe midway in my career, it's probably, like I said, about 15 or so years ago is when I started doing enterprise architecture. And for me, EA, it's kind of like in between business and IT, right? So yes, you speak the IT language, you pull on that, but always, again, back to connecting it to real business value and understanding what we're trying to do.
So with enterprise architecture, this is something that I've talked about in different contexts, not too much on this show in particular, but I feel that enterprise architecture may be a lost art in a lot of organizations. What's your reaction to that statement? Is that true? Is that something you would disagree with, or where do you stand on that?
Yeah, I can see that, to say that it's a lost art. And, what I'm finding a lot of times, some folks, when they're thinking about enterprise architecture, mind directly goes into the technical part of it, the solution and going, especially these days, how do we go to the cloud and bringing in shiny tools? For me, enterprise architecture, starts again with the business, right? It's about the business capabilities and processes, and it's about understanding the data that feeds our systems and our processes. Technology comes after that, and I think yes, there is a misunderstanding about what EA is, what it tries to do. I think part of that is because, in my experience, folks kind of tend to gravitate to, let's just go build a solution. And here's where enterprise architecture says, well, wait a minute, let's just look at this end to end. Because typically things are getting built through a project. And if you look at this end to end, you might realize outside of the scope of this project, 2-3 steps down the process flow, there might be impacts. So let's understand that. And again, I sound like a broken record almost, but what is the business capability? What is it really that we're trying to solve before we go figure out what we need to build with our tools and build a technical solution? If we don't understand that as well, it's very possible we use the wrong tool for the wrong reason. So taking a step back and understanding that it's important. And not everybody starts from that perspective. So from that perspective, to your point, kind of a lost art. It's an art and a science too, by the way. I'm sorry to continue this, but I think that's the other thing about EA. In my mind, it's both a science and an art, because a lot of it, because it's the kind of mindset that it's not the most common out there, I think, and you always have to have the conversation about why is it important to just take a moment and understand the end-to-end picture. That takes a lot of communication skills and influencing and just making the point in a way that whoever the audience is at the time resonates with them.
Right. And what I probably should have started with before discussing whether it was a lost art or not is, what does an enterprise architect really do? Like, what is the fundamentals of that role, kind of broadly speaking, in an organization?
Yeah, I think it's some of what I mentioned. So basically, our organizations are complex. In so many years right now, the way we work, most efforts out there involved a lot of different systems, cross-functional efforts, many different processes and systems. So an enterprise architect really is, how do we pull on the best practices out there to pull that together, how we architect it in a way that can solve our issues now, but can also sustain for the long term. It can flex and it can scale. And it looks at that, again, not just from the technology perspective, but there's different ways that people have defined DA and A pillars. Very simpler, one way that I think of it is, starting with the business capabilities and business process, that business architecture. Data is very important. Yes, the technology. Yes, the solution, the infrastructure. And then even if I think back to, I'm thinking of our friend John Zachman there, right? Kind of like answering all of those questions, the what, when, why, how, what layer. So bringing all of that together, making sense out of it so that we set that solid foundation that can flex and scale and be there to enable the processes that we're building for at the time.
Yeah, it reminds me, John Zachman, who anyone who doesn't know that name in our listeners is largely considered one of the fathers of enterprise architecture, and has the Zachman framework is famous. I got to meet him for the first time. It was several years ago now at an enterprise data world conference. And I sat in on one of his sessions. He sat in on one of my sessions, and I got an autograph, like Zachman framework diagram that I now have framed and mounted in my office at work. And I think about that, and it's right next to the whiteboard very intentionally, because I know that thinking in that kind of structured form is easily forgotten in our world of rapid development and DevOps, which I'm a huge advocate for. Don't get me wrong. I really like that stuff. But I also think that there is something to be said for coordination, especially at the enterprise level. There are so many things to either be amplified and leveraged at scale and creating synergies and things like that when done well, or the amount of cost and complexity that you don't need to incur if done improperly. Enterprise architecture, I mean, from everything that you were just saying, I'm like, you just described data leadership too. Like this is the kind of thing that we're doing all the time. And yet it's a different term. It's, I think, a term that has been around a lot longer than the notion of data leadership, but we're talking about the same stuff, and this stuff is really important. And I think it naturally leads me to a question that I want to ask you as you wear your enterprise architect hat. How does an enterprise architect interface with data governance? Like, how do those two things come together?
Right, yeah. And one of the main pillars of enterprise architecture is enterprise data architecture. Actually, enterprise information architecture is how I prefer to refer to it. I think work very well together, because from the data governance perspective as well, and when I say data governance, I include data governance and data stewardship, right? Not just the policies for what we do, but actually really the stewarding to the integrity of the data, what it means, understanding what it means. So again, it goes back to, we need to understand that, right? And then when we're pulling in the enterprise information architecture and we're thinking about the data, how does it flow end to end? What are the interdependencies? Where should we go get it from? We cannot really successfully answer those questions with confidence unless we understand, well, what does this data mean? What does it enable? How do we use it in our day-to-day process, in our day-to-day, lives, right? And some of those questions, or a lot of those questions, data governance and stewardship will help get those answers. And so I think they're very, very, very close related. The other thing I wanted to say, Anthony, with enterprise architecture, one of the things that I've seen in my experience, whenever we have a big program out there, a big solution, you mentioned coordination before. Where I see things break is usually around integrations, where downstream does not get what they expect to get from upstream thinks that they give downstream what they want. So again, if we don't talk to each other, first of all, if we're going to speak the same language, meaning that data, right, that gets integrated, if the meaning is not consistently understood and we know what we're going for, we're going to end up with those integrations. So from an EA perspective and a data governance perspective, I think working together is making sure that, we're taking a moment to just understand what that is and be proactive about it, and not address it as after we went live with a program, it broke because we didn't think about it, because we never took the moment, because we just tried to just solution builds at the technical layer.
Yeah. And in absence of enterprise architecture, I think we see things start to become more fragmented. Because when I think enterprise architecture, I'm thinking like you care and have purview around data governance. You have purview around functionality and technology systems. And then you also have an influence and responsibility towards business process and the outcomes on the business side. And so you sit at a level where you can coordinate those effectively because you have the right kind of vantage point. If we don't have somebody who's taking that kind of macro view across the entirety of all of those things, I think we have a tendency to think of data governance as, well, data is important, so data governance is important, so we got to do good data governance. And then we forget how to connect it to all that other stuff. Like it starts to spin as this like thing for its own existence, which leads to bad outcomes. And so in your experience, because you have this purview across these different functional domains, right, what does it take to be successful with enterprise data governance, and how do you leverage the strengths from those different areas to support all of those areas? Because I think that's the funny thing about these things is like we fragment them in terms of functional responsibilities and job titles and things like that. But at the end of the day, it's not like you have a terrible technology development organization and an awesome data governance organization. Probably it's all going to be bad at that point. Like it's how do we do things collectively? And I think you made a great point around integration being that part where things break. I would argue that that's the part where we measure what's breaking and we see what's breaking, but oftentimes what caused it to break are breakdowns in these kind of core functional silos that we tend to have.
Yeah, absolutely. So what does it take, to your question, what does it take to be successful? Definitely that coordination and communicating and collaborating and coordinating across these end-to-end solutions, it's top of mind for me. But because we're talking about enterprise data governance, I'm sure you too have heard, we know of programs starting, getting the momentum and kind of failing. We need that executive sponsorship. There's many efforts that start bottoms up, but you cannot just continue that way. I think we need the executive sponsorship. Otherwise, we will kind of fade and falter over time. But it also takes, if I go with the cliche, people, process, technology, it takes people, but it takes also having the right people in the right role. Mm-hmm. So let's think about this for a second. If I have 2 programs and everything is the same technology, same data, all equal, and people are good, but if the people are not in the right roles, the right skill set in the right role, I think we're going to see a difference there. So that executive sponsorship, having the right skills for the right role, using the right enabling technologies, I tend to say the right tool for the right job, right? And there are enabling technologies specifically for data governance and data management, data quality, things like that. It takes investment in all of this. This is not a trivial effort. I think that's something else that folks sometimes underestimate. And to me, understanding too that this is a journey, this is a program. This is not a project where, okay, we're going to do data governance today, we're done, 6 months or 12 months later, we're done. I mean, it's an ongoing program, and understanding and planning for that, it's also critical to success in my mind. And just really, you said something before about the agile world that we live in, right? So it's somewhere where we have to balance it all. We can't just totally forget those foundational, like back to the basics, right? We cannot forget those factors. We have to balance it. Obviously, we need to show quick wins in order to get the momentum, but put that thought leadership in there and have the discipline of pulling in these basics in order for this to continue showing success for the longer term as well. I'm sure there's more things there, but I think these come top to mind for me as very critical.
Yeah. And obviously the motivation, we talk in data leadership about data value all the time. Like we talk about, okay, how are we driving these meaningful changes in the business? And, how do we ensure that our actions are ultimately, resulting in things that are beneficial, hopefully in the end. And that all this work around data can like lead to true business impact, so some business improvement. You talk about, driving with a business data purpose mindset. What do you mean by that? And how do we start to do that more?
Right. Yeah. This is actually, I gave a talk, I think last year, the topic of which was it was data at the heart of your business requirements, because it was intended towards like a business analyst community. But what it means driving with a business data purpose mindset, again, I was referring to business analysts, I was referring to requirements. It's not just about looking at requirements. Okay, typically you have the requirements, maybe you have a list of different data attributes, and then we go and build, maybe we'll do some mappings. But if we don't understand the business context of that, and for me, it's going back, working with the business and really getting down to the bottom of it. why we want to do what we want to do. Is this what we really need? Sometimes, to tell me if you've seen this yourself or if you haven't, but I've seen cases where, we're getting requests to do something, right? Or there's an idea there, but sometimes you just gotta think it through even more, and you gotta trigger that to really understand what is it really. Even if I ask for a KPI, well, why that one? What is it going to drive? What is the business value? What is it going to help us measure, right? So what is the business context, and then what is the purpose for that data before we go ahead and build with it and find after the fact, well, that's not really what we needed anyway. So by understanding the business context, which is required to answer the question, what is the purpose, the business purpose for this? I think that's critical. And that's what I mean by driving with a business data purpose mindset.
That's just music to my ears, because like that, I think about like, I often think like people will ask for whatever they're going to ask for. They're going to have ideas of what they want to use and ideas of how it might look. And like, I hate the term requirements. I talk about that elsewhere. I hate the term requirements because it's so hard and it's so one directional. It's like, give me this. And it's like, wait. Like what I like to do is start to create this notion of a true collaboration. And one thing that I talk about sometimes that I think really aligns with what you're talking about is pushing beyond the interesting, which means I want to go beyond just stuff that you're like, oh, I'd like to know this, and say, what is it that I could tell you that would lead you to doing two different things? Like, what is that point? When do you decide to go option A versus option B? Because if we can get to that level of clarity, then not only can we provide you that, but we can automate that. We can actually create the action then. If we can get to that level of clarity. Now we can't always do that, but that's where it's like, why not shoot for 500 and get 400 instead of shooting for 100 and getting 80? Like that to me is where, if we can be in a proactive mindset with the people that are stand to benefit from whatever it is that we create for them, then we will all be better off in the end. And I think what I have this idea. It's been percolating in my head for a while. I've talked about it here and there, but it's this notion of driving governance and driving architecture types of decisions by the builders, by the ones that are creating technology and business process and outcomes, versus those that are simply trying to take care of the asset or the data itself. Like, where have you found success or challenge in orienting data governance, transformation, organizational change from a technology organization versus more on the business side, who are clearly know the business outcomes better, but may not be as aware, kind of coming back to this notion of the requirements and that stuff, may not be aware of what is possible on the technology side or what it takes to produce what they're thinking about. Like, there's two different ways to do it. And I think every time we try to say, well, let's just do it in the middle, there's not enough people in the middle to really get that foothold to make either happen. So which one should we do? Should we drive this kind of stuff out of the technology org, or should we drive it out of the business org? And whichever one we choose, how do we pull along the other? I think that's the question I'm going for.
Right. Well, first of all, I just want to comment a little bit about requirements and how you don't like this term. Look, requirements, user stories. It's kind of like IT, but IT is the business too. That argument, right? Mm-hmm. It's the term that we use. So it's what it is that we're trying to do. Sure. So I think you've kind of said it before, and I agree with you. It really takes that partnership, collaboration, working together. Now, because we have to have some kind of a structure to recognize things, and then always need to fold in that collaboration, coordination, transparency, understanding. And we can talk about the cultural transformation as well. But because we have to have some more structures, I would say that the better place for data governance specifically, I would put it in the business. Because it really, again, it goes back to, we're not doing data governance for the sake of data. This is about our business, right? What is it that what are our business pain points that we're trying to solve for? How is data and the technology and all these other things going to help us solve for that? And it starts with just getting that understanding of what is this? How are we using it? What is the meaning of it, right? What is it going to help us do? And And back to the previous point, asking those questions, and sometimes to get to that, it's kind of like the 5 whys, right? Don't just take whatever you hear to really get down to the root of it. Kind of like ask almost the 5 whys, a different way depending on the audience and everything. But that's where I know we're floating a lot of things here, but I mean, that's another skill that it's really important for how we communicate. How do you get that out of people's heads? Right. By asking the right questions and working and collaborating with them.
Yeah, I have to agree with you. I really feel like at the end of the day, if we have too much technology-led data work, it tends to spin off into a lot of minutia with limited value. There's a lot of stuff happening. It kind of comes back to the earlier point I made around like pushing past the interesting. It's kind of a different flavor of that. It's really like we can create tons of metadata. How much of that metadata is actually anything anyone cares about? Very little, right? And like the hardest metadata to extract is the stuff in people's brains. And that we don't even know where to put that half the time. It's like, wait. Like that's the part that really matters. It's the story. It's not about data. It's about the story. Business has that story. And I'd rather focus my energies on giving business the right tools and the right training and the right, like, here's how you take what's in your head and put that into a place other people can use it. That seems like a better path in aggregate than saying, hey, technology people, figure out all the business and put it into the tools you know well. Like that is probably an oversimplification, certainly, but like I think if we have to pick one, I think I have to agree with you is that you have to have that leadership from the business side, because ultimately they are the ones who are creating those things that are measured with data but aren't fully and completely represented by data. And that, like, I've often talked about like data being the closest thing we have to truth in an organization, but it's not the same thing as what's actually true. And I think the business really represents what's actually true, certainly more than the technology org is able to. So I think conceptually that all makes sense. And I would tend to agree with you. So
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
my question is then, how do we do that? Like, how do we actually achieve that? And how do we start to measure the right things? Or how do we start to, get an organization that is focused on business outcomes, which is probably what an organization should focus on. But how do we get them to start thinking about data more proactively as something to manage versus just an output from the business stuff that they're doing already?
Yeah, exactly. And what you just said, managing it not just processing that data, right? It's not about creating the data mappings across the solutions and just having a whole lot of that data go through the pipes, right? But how do we manage it? How do we start doing that? I'm going to go back to what I said before, which I think it's really critical to have the right people in the right roles.
Yeah.
I've at some point in my career, I came across a situation where a very competent person and everything, but was put there to lead enterprise data governance for the organization. Well, very competent, very intelligent, hardworking person, but they were very tactical, operational mindset. They were not in the right role. So there is a lot of education, we're going back to data literacy and data leadership. There's a lot of education to get people to understand, why is this important for us to do it? What does it mean? But it takes someone that has the personality, if you will, has that vision, has the influencing skills, has the resilience to keep pushing against the status quo. Because that's another thing that we need to manage with an enterprise information management or enterprise data governance, whatever we call the program, right? Typically, organizations, they've grown in different silos. And typically, we're getting into those issues where we don't speak the same language. We can't really integrate. We say, oh, we need data governance. We got to speak the same language, right? It needs to go. It needs to go back to that. And you need the person to, with a status quo, when people have been used to doing it in their silos, right? And they have their own goals, right? How do we make people to come together, work together? Which brings me to another point, still answering your question there. How do we start measuring? how we successful with this, if you will. Another point is having those measurable goals. Once we have the leader with a vision of the resilience, we do have then to have the more execution, focused execution, operational minds. We have to have the right tools to help us as well. But all of that, and we have to connect it to the business value, like we said, but how do we measure it? And how do we make sure that it's not just a nice to do if I have time, but it's somebody's measurable goal to do data stewardship, for example, which is, a component there of enterprise data governance. I think that's pretty instrumental as well to the success of the program, along with executive sponsorship behind it to back it up, and the other things that we talked about.
Yeah, I'm so happy to hear you talk about metrics around stewardship. And it's like, well, too often I hear the data governance folks out there and not quantifying the work that they're doing. And I'm like, guys, we're missing a huge opportunity here. Like we can not only get better at what we're trying to do ourselves, but this can also be a great example to all the people that we're working with, that we're trying to get them to become more quantitative in what they're doing as well. And so that mentality I love to see, because that I've seen a lot of well-intended folks say those words, but not take it any further. So what kinds of actual metrics do you like to implement in, either a data governance context or even just an enterprise architecture context? Because we have a lot of people that talk about data on this show, but I don't have a whole lot of enterprise architects by trade on the show. So I really want to make sure we extract as much of that EA specific perspective as you can through that set of responsibilities you have as well.
Right. So around metrics, well, the first point we talked about measurable goals, right? And that means that we have very clearly defined roles, responsibilities with measurable goals. And it's somebody's part of somebody's job. It doesn't have to be the entire 100% of what they do, but it's something that it's measured, there's performance objectives around it. Now, specifically around the metrics, there's a lot of different metrics, right? With data quality, obviously, we can benchmark ourselves and measure over time from a data quality perspective how we're doing. Or if we go more to enterprise architecture, we can have metrics around, how many integrations we have break before we were doing this and now after, right? But then those are metrics. I think the more telling, especially to the business and the leadership, are tracking over time too. Well, with all of that we're doing, have we actually moved the needle, right? What are those KPIs that we said we were going to actually impact because we understood what it is? We were solving for a particular specific problem. Okay, that problem, what does it relate to? What strategic goal? What KPI is behind that? So if we start doing all of this and we keep tracking at the same time, how has that helped us actually go forward with whatever that KPI is? Has it helped us with getting less complaints about our products, for example, right? And with enterprise architecture, you asked about that specifically. That could be another metric as well, right? If we're having all these different needs, how quick are we to flex our systems to scale us, right? Because we've got that solid foundation. And then are we, for example, getting less customer service complaints because we have thought this through, we are providing a better customer experience, our products don't break. I think it's all connected, but we do have to be specific. So in each one of our organizations, each one of our industries, I think it's important to take the time to understand what exactly are we trying to target, and then kind of backtrack for that. I think pulling into these foundational best practices, if you will, and then measure it along the way to actually show, is it really hitting the mark? Because if it's not, that's another thing. You reassess. Maybe this is not what we needed to be working on, right? So let's reassess. But how can we tell that without having the specific metrics and tracking them to tell us if we're on the right track?
Oh, that's awesome insights into like implementing metrics, and you sparked a thought in my mind, because I've talked about how do we establish metrics, and just doing the calculation seems to be tough enough a lot of the time. But then I think about, okay, we're in an organization and we're fighting the good fight, trying to get more quantification, and we're doing our data governance, and we're starting to make some inroads and all of that. But we still have this challenge of how do we get people who are not accustomed to managing anything quantitatively? How do we
Mhm.
get them to pay attention to the metrics and start changing how they listen to data and start doing something new? What advice do you have for trying to get somebody to turn an organization to turn that corner to become more quantitative and pay attention to these metrics that we've now started to create?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's not an easy thing to do, and not everybody's thought goes directly to it. I think, like a lot of other things, it's making it a specific goal and really putting the effort behind it, like investing in it. Just like with everything else, if we're saying we want to be more quantitative, okay, that's a goal. So, okay, how we're gonna organize ourselves around getting there. The same thing with enterprise data governance. We talk a lot about culture transformation and changing people's habits. Okay, this is not going to happen by itself. How do we actually specifically invest in that goal? What is it going to take? And what is it going to take is getting in the right people. Again, what is it that we're targeting, right? What are those phases that we want to hit? Because nothing is going to happen overnight. And that's another thing I think to understand. None of these things are happening overnight. It takes time, it takes effort, it takes resilience, right? So I think treating it as a very specific goal and organize it as, I'm not saying, like having a very intentional effort behind it that we measure. There's that's how we'll do it. And there's different ways, different frameworks out there for how we do that. Not to get into that detail, we could, but simply put, just being intentional about it.
Well, and man, that is good advice for a lot of things, is to be intentional, just to
Yeah.
say, hey, this stuff needs to be important. And if you have some of those core things like executive sponsorship, and they hear in real sponsorship is being able to commit ideas or resources towards achieving an end. It's not just saying, yeah, we're on board with this. It's actually some commitment, right? And so having that intention and following through with it, and finding a way, I think is all, great advice, whether you're trying to become more quantified in your data governance organization, or you're trying to establish some enterprise architecture practices, or you're simply trying to think about how you're managing budget, anything, right? So like I think that's incredible advice. So we only have a couple minutes left, and so
So,
I want to play it back to you, like,
okay.
any topics we missed. What else do you want to say before we run out of time? Because I feel like I've jumped around, and there's been a couple times where you're like, I wanted to say something else. I'll open it back up to you. What part do you want to reemphasize before we wrap it up today?
So it's actually right about what we were talking. I think the other critical thing is just communicate. We may be
Mm.
doing great things, but if we don't communicate for the word to go out there to show the value, what is the value? We're shooting ourselves in the foot, so to speak, right? We're not making the progress that we could make. For me, it's like, location, 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 real estate. For me, it's like communication, communication, communication. You just can never have enough, whatever that takes. Showcase it. Let people hear about it. Let people understand. There'll be spark. They'll come up with more ideas. Hey, need the help here. And this, I think, is going to help as well to just be more pervasive across the organization, because especially talking about larger organizations, there's so many thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of systems, processes, right? Relationships, all of that stuff. I mean, there's a lot of different ways, and different ways too, different forums to put it out there. But when we put it out there, again, being intentionally and very clear, right? Here's what it is, here's what we did, here how it's helped us, right? How can we help you? Put it out there,
Yeah.
communicate.
That I couldn't agree more. That's awesome advice, and I think that's a great place to close. And I just thank you for sharing your wisdom, and for being on the show today, Dora. It's been awesome having you.
Anthony, this has been so much fun. Thank you so much. Truly honored to be on here. Thank you for the opportunity. And hopefully this is helpful to some folks out there.
It no doubt will be. So thanks again. And thank you all for watching or listening today. In the show notes, you'll find useful links and more information about today's topic. Follow Data Leadership Lessons on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. Check out my book at dataleadershipbook.com and use promo code AlgmanDL at Dataversity Training Center for 20% off your first purchase. Stay safe during these unusual times and go make an impact.